to introduce Dr. Boudewijn Walraven. Dr. Boudewijn Walraven is a professor emeritus at Leiden University and currently a visiting professor at Sungkyunkwan University. Let me briefly introduce Dr. Walraven before we begin. Dr. Walraven studied at the Leiden University where he obtained his PhD, and he also studied at Seoul National University as an exchange student. From his first publication, which is a study of the social implications of sorcery accusation in Joseon period, he has been interested in the use of anthropological approaches to Korean culture and history. Recently, his research focuses on two projects. One is the study of the Buddhist practice in late Joseon period, seen through the vernacular songs and paintings. The other is the anthropology of history, an inquiry into the social conditions and social functions of both the production and consumption of history, that is, history in the sense of representation of the past. Dr. Walraven is also a founding member of the Association for Korean Studies in Europe, which he has served as the president for 2 4-year terms. Presently, he is the editor of the Sungkyunkwan Journal of East Asian Studies and the online journal Korean Histories. In 2003, he was awarded the Order of Cultural Merit, 보감문화훈장, by the government of the Republic of Korea. He has many publications, but I'd like to introduce most recent publications of him. He wrote about Dasan 정약용's writing recently. The title is Dasan's Writing as a Resource for the Historical Anthropology of Late Joseon Society. And he also wrote about the Buddhism and Confucianism, and the title of the article is Buddhist Accommodation and Appropriation and the Limits of Confucianization. And lastly, there are many others, but lastly, for the introduction, he wrote about Jeju Island too. The Jeju 1901, Records, Memories, and the Current Concerns. Today, Dr. Walraven will give us a talk with the title, Heaven and Hell in Joseon Korea, Religious Pluralism in Korea's Past. Please welcome Dr. Boudewijn Walraven with a warm round of applause.
Thank you for this very kind introduction. I hope I will not disappoint you, but I'll try to go with you through a part, I think an important part of Korean religious history. There's an assumption, a kind of common assumption, or a stereotype even, which like many stereotypes has some kernel of truth in it. And that is that when the Joseon dynasty started, Buddhism lost its privileged position as the national religion and was pushed away by Confucianism. And Confucians were persecuted even, or oppressed, and the result has been that Koreans became more Confucian than even the Chinese. For instance, in one quite recent article, a Korean historian of religion said that in Korea at present, even the Christians, the Buddhists, and all other people of all other religions, in some way they are Confucians. And so the influence of Confucianism has been enormous according to this theory, and it has been great. There's no denying that, but there are certain limitations to it, I think, as well. This story about the influence of Confucianism is also influential in that it becomes a kind of explanation, I don't think actually a real explanation, but an explanation why certain things are the way they are in Korea. I think actually many times you will have in discussions met someone who said, yeah, it's because of Confucianism that things are like this, and quite diverse things actually are assigned to this explanation. But as far as Buddhism goes, one result of this view is that many people have thought early on that, especially in the second half of the Joseon period, so that's roughly in the period from 1600 to 1900, Buddhism was hardly worth studying, which I don't think. I think actually many important things happened in this period. I also believe that the influence of Confucianism has been not so dominant as people sometimes think. And I also believe, and I will explain this later on during this talk, that particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, certain things happen which still in some way influence the state of affairs at this moment. And so if we have a different look of the position of Buddhism in the late Joseon period, I think we'll gain also a clearer perspective on what is going on in Korea at the moment. First, a little bit of history very quickly. I think actually the president of the Academy already has mentioned several of the things, but in the beginning there was absolutely no conflict between Buddhism and Confucianism. In fact, certain Confucian values were spread by Buddhist monks rather than by Confucians. And then the big change occurs, has been mentioned already tonight, when the new dynasty starts in 1392, and there are people who advise the government who are Neo-Confucians, and Neo-Confucians in China already had absorbed certain parts of Buddhism, which in a way made Neo-Confucianism a rival to Buddhism, rather than something which could easily exist together. And there were certain practical reasons also to limit the influence of Buddhism. And the Buddhist monasteries had become rich, and the new government needed land, for instance, to reward its followers. So it was a good thing for the government maybe to expropriate some of the land from the Buddhist monasteries and give it to their own followers. But Buddhism, in spite of this, survived. But one thing that really happened is that it was no longer the official religion, so it was pushed to the private sphere. But the private sphere is still incredibly important, so in the lives of many people. So Buddhism also remained important. And the question I will be talking about in the next minutes is how did it survive and what forms, and also to what extent. First, a list of the things that happened in the first century of the Joseon period, so in the 15th century. On the left, there are the negative things. On the right, the more positive things. And so the expropriation of temple property I've already mentioned. There was also a reduction in the number of sects, or the Buddhists were forced to go together into a smaller number of sects. Buddhism ritual was excluded from state ritual. For instance, in the beginning, for certain, if there would be an epidemic, for instance, you might do Buddhist ritual, but already by the middle of the 15th century, a unfortunate examination candidate for the official examinations, who was so unfortunate to mention Buddhist ritual as a solution to epidemics, and he was exiled to the provinces, and of course he failed the examination. Then there were anti-Buddhist polemics. There were certain Neo-Confucians started to produce writings that disparaged Buddhism, and the social status of monks became lower, but also I think not as low as sometimes is claimed always. On the other side, we can observe that the early kings of the Joseon period still were very deeply involved in Buddhism. For instance, King Sejong had a great inventor of Hangul. He composed a song, Worin Chongang Jigok, the song of the moon reflected on 1,000 rivers, and the moon is the one truth which in many forms is reflected to our human world. And his son, who became later on King Sejong, had also sutras translated into Korean with the newly invented Hangul. And he himself collaborated on a prose biography of the Buddha. The Worin Chongang Jigok in first form also had a kind of biography of the Buddha. So they were still deeply involved with Buddhism. And here you see a kind of reminder. It's a painting on the wall of a temple. And this King Sejong, and there's a story about this. King Sejong suffered of terrible sores on his back, which were very itchy and unpleasant. And at one moment he went to Odaesan. Now Odaesan is the Korean pronunciation of Wutaishan, which is a mountain in China, about which there was the tradition that if you would go to this mountain, you could meet the Bodhisattva Manjushri, and the Bodhisattva of wisdom. And the name was taken over, and also this idea traveled to Korea. So in the story, King Sejong goes to Odaesan, is suffering from these sores on his back, sees a little brook in the mountains, and thinks, I'll take a bath, it will be very pleasant and soothing for me. While he's doing this, there comes a little monk, and the little monk helps him to wash his back. And then the king is very happy, actually, but he says to the little monk, he shouldn't tell anyone who I am, because he's ashamed. And then the little monk said, and you shouldn't tell anyone either, because I'm Manjushri, I'm the Bodhisattva who helps you. So anyway, King Sejong was actually, in spite of, he did some very un-Buddhist things, like killing his nephew, for instance, to get on the throne, but he was the most Buddhist king of the whole Joseon period. Buddhists very quickly decided it was necessary in some ways to adapt to the new situation. So against these anti-Buddhist polemics, you have writings by Buddhists who claim that in some ways they're not all as bad as the Confucians, the Neo-Confucians, make out. One of these monks is Kiwa, or Hamho Tukdong, and he uses actually Confucian arguments to justify Buddhism. He refers to the great learning, the Tashui, the Taeak in Korean, and he says, I perceive that the directives of the Tripitaka, the Buddhist canon, are intended to do nothing more than to prompt people to abandon passions and to realize their natures. If we teach people to cultivate themselves while relying on this doctrine, then their minds can be rectified, their persons cultivated, their families regulated, the nation ordered, and all under heaven will be appeased. What is in red is actually literally from the Tashui. So he uses Confucian texts to justify Buddhism. Another famous monk from the Joseon period was Hyujong Societas, who lived in the late in the 16th century, and who wrote a book in which he claimed that Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism are actually basically the same, although Buddhism is slightly better than the other kinds. So, but they all represent real truth. So he didn't deny. He was a real pluralist in a way. Societas, we can come back to that again. He was also the commander of the monks' armies that fought the Japanese when they invaded in the last decade of the 16th century. And another person who was in some ways very adept in manipulating Confucian texts was a monk called Chimguang. His very name, Chimguang, is taken from the analects, the sayings of Confucius. And it means to use your elbow as a pillow, like when you're sleeping, very simply. You have nothing, no real pillow, you just sleep on your arm, like students sometimes do in the library after they become very tired. He wrote this verse, which I have written here and read. In the eating of coarse rice and the drinking of water, the using of one's elbow for a pillow, joy is to be found. Wealth and rank to me are as passing clouds. Aspiring to the golden days of Amitabha, I listen to the wind in the branches. After the clouds, that is his own, what he wrote himself. The rest is cited literally from the analects of Confucius. And so he uses, again, Confucian texts to justify himself. But he gives it a kind of Buddhist twist in the end. And there's also a monk, again, a later period, and more the period about which I want to speak most, Yondam Yuil. And at a certain moment he writes a letter to a Confucian acquaintance of his, and he says that Buddhism actually is also good, but he also says that even if you practice only Confucian virtues, you may go to the Pure Land, a kind of paradise of Amitabha. So you don't have to even to be a Buddhist. If you behave according to Confucian norms, that may be sufficient to bring you to the paradise, the Pure Land of Amitabha. And he said, so he concluded it's not just the practice of Buddhism that leads one to paradise. When you read the songs which were composed in quite considerable numbers by Buddhists in the late Joseon period to propagate the faith, you see that they also propagate what people are inclined to call Confucian virtues. For instance, there's a song with a description of what happens if you die, you will be judged. And the judges will look, for instance, will ask, did you do your utmost and loyal service to king and country? Have you been a loyal citizen, a loyal servant of the country? Were you filial to your parents, and did you uphold family customs? And so this is pure, in a way, Confucianism. There's a sutra which was produced actually in China, which is about filial piety, the idea that you have to be good to your parents, you have to serve your parents. I have added a question mark to Confucian origins because the idea, of course, that you should honor your parents is not exclusively Confucian. You find it also even earlier in India, but it's no doubt that once Buddhism came to China, it was emphasized because it went well with Chinese values. And so you have this sutra about the great debt you have towards your parents. And why do you have this debt? Because your parents in all kinds of ways have cared for you while you were small. And here on kind of posters at the Jogesa, the temple here in Seoul, you see parts of the sutra elucidated. For instance, your mother has taken care of you when it's hot, fanned you, kept you warm at other times. On the picture on the left, actually, it's about how the mother will take care that the nappies are changed and so that the baby is always comfortable. And of course, the mothers will feed her children with their own milk, which I just saw on BBC this afternoon. Increases your intelligence apparently if you're breastfed. This is also a picture which is in a way, it is on a temple wall, but it's also an illustration of the sutra. And it's about the fact that to parents, children always remain children. Even if the parent is, let's say, 90 and the child is 70, the parent will still worry about the child. And that's what you see on this picture. Huh? So the white-haired lady is the mother, and the daughter, who was already bent, although she has retained her black hair, maybe dyed, is walking in front of her, and the mother is saying, take care. Huh? So the care remains, so you have to be thankful for that as well. So that is filial piety. Then loyalty, the important chung, the Confucian, not only Neo-Confucian, but Confucian virtue. Already mentioned, I think many of you know very well about this. This at the end of the 16th century, when the Japanese invaded, the government called on the monks to help defend the country, and that's what they did. And the great leader of the monk armies was the Societas, Hyujong, and but there were many other monks. Societas was already in his 70s at that time, was too old to fight himself, but the younger monks really took very active part in the fighting, and they were afterwards honored by the government for this, which in several places made little shrines for these monks. And this is actually an interesting case because usually these shrines were separate institutions, and the name sounded exactly the same as this name, Pyo Chung Sa, but they used a different Sa for shrine, which has no Buddhist connotations. But in the 19th century, the government decided to move one of these shrines to a Buddhist temple in Miryang, in Gyeongsang-do. So it came back in a way to Buddhism, which is in a way very telling, I think. And I hope that after I have told you the rest of the story, you will understand why. So Samyong or Samyongdang was one of the monks who actually took part in the fighting. Afterwards also went to Japan as an envoy of the government and came back with Koreans who had been taken to Japan. And today he is honored at the entrance of the Dongguk University, Buddhist University. So on the right you see how the monks actually fight, contradicting the idea maybe many people in the West have that Buddhists are pacifists. Absolute pacifists. In some ways also you see that the ideas about the way the cosmos is organized and what happens to people, for instance, if they die, are not so different when you consider Buddhists and Confucians, or even people who have recourse to shamanic rituals. There are rituals, for instance, for the what is sometimes called the restless dead, the people who have died often in a violent way and are unable to, because of this, to go on to the next stage, and are potentially also a danger to the living. In Buddhism, they had rituals for this, and you see a depiction of these rituals in paintings called Gamno Tengha, of which we will see some examples afterwards. Sweet dew or nectar paintings. In Confucianism, you had a ritual called Yojie, which was performed till the early 20th century actually, but people have more or less forgotten about it. It has disappeared. One time I went to the headquarters of the Confucian organizations next to Sungkyunkwan, the Yurin Haegwan, And I asked about this, and then first the person I talked to said, what was this? And then he said this shamanic ritual. But it's not at all shamanic ritual. It's a ritual which was done by the servants of the king, and in a way it was an orthodox ritual. Maybe not very Confucian in origin, but certainly performed by Confucians without any problem. And then you have the shamanic rituals, so where you have many, many spirits of people who died in violent ways. So you see, there's still a kind of common ground for the different religions. Here you have a modern example of one of these nectar paintings, of sweet dew paintings, in which you always see in the middle of, or slightly above the middle, the actual ritual that is performed. You have the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who are, in a way, guarantee that the ritual works. And then in the lower parts you have different scenes of daily life sometimes, but also of the ways people die in an unnatural manner. For instance, when they're eaten by a tiger, you see here, and some other painting it's more obvious even. You have more people who were depicted in their final moments of accidental death. When you look at Buddhist rituals in this period, it's very clear that a lot has to do with the care for the dead. The rituals that were performed in connection with these nectar paintings, for instance, are also for people in your own family who have recently died. And these prints, which are made at Bongwensa, the temple which is near the Coex these days, but used to be on the not the outskirts of Seoul, it was far outside Seoul actually, a considerable distance from the city itself, are also for that purpose. Here you see a rosary where all the beads have gotten a meaning. In a way it's a kind of mandala, but here on the bottom is an inscription which tells you why this print was made at all. It was made at the behest of a rich lady who did it for the dead in her own family, so that they would be able to go on in the next life to paradise. So this care for people who are dead is in a way also an extension of filial piety, of course. So it accords very well with Confucianism. But also accorded well with Confucianism at a certain level are prayers for the birth of children, because lack of descendants is the utmost form of lack of filial piety. So you really need descendants to perform chesa, the sacrificial offerings to the ancestors. So childlessness is absolutely to be avoided. And although Confucians often would object to prayers for specific purposes, in this case they would allow it sometimes. And you see that King Chongzhou at a certain moment also recognizes that a descendant is born, and he thanks to the prayers at Buddhist temples or rituals at Buddhist temples. You see this happening in a way also. It's a modern painting also on a temple wall of a temple in Jinju actually. You see the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, or Kwan in Japanese Kannon, or Kuan Yin, who in China and Korea and in Japan is very often female, but in Korea mostly male, although there are female manifestations as well. But here you see very clearly there's so facial hair, which makes clear it's not a woman. But anyway, he grants his child to this couple who have prayed for it. There is a theory, or there is an opinion which is often quoted that because Buddhism was persecuted by Confucianism, it went down in society. It became the religion of the great mass of the people. And maybe to a certain extent this happened actually, although I think probably more likely they continued actually to practice shamanic rituals with maybe some kind of Buddhist influence. But it's also absolutely certain that very prominent and rich people continue to be the patrons of Buddhism. And if you look at paintings like this, it's quite obvious this is not done by poor peasants or something, or commissioned by poor peasants. This is done by people who have money to spend. Also, there were books published, sometimes with illustrations, which makes it, of course, more costly to produce. And for the educated people, most of these books actually are also in Hanmun, so in written Chinese. So they're for the well-to-do with education. These royal graves were already mentioned also today by the president of the AKS. One child had a wish temple, you could freely literally translate, or one a wish hall. And in spite of the fact that the government officially didn't want much to have to do with Buddhism, it is so that wherever there is a temple, wherever there is a royal grave, you will find a temple, not immediately in sight, but very close, nearby. And these temples had given the orders to take care of the well-being in the afterlife of the royal dead. The quote here is from Charles Allen Clark. It dates from the 1920s. And wherever you go these days also, you will find these temples if you look for them. And you find in many cases also that if you go to these temples, that there is the character Pong to serve in the name of the temple. The Pong and Sa, for instance, I mentioned before, you'll see the picture afterwards also, is a good example. And very often also these temples have Kuk, country, but it could also refer to the king in the name. So here there are some more examples. King Yongjo made Yonhasa the grave prayer temple for his predecessor Gyeongjong and Gyeongjong's wife. Jingwan-sa was the wondang of Yongjo's mother, and Pongwon-sa of his grandchild. So there's no way that after the 15th century the royal house cut its connection with Buddhism, not at all. King Cheongjo went even further. I think many of you know the story of King Cheongjo's father, who was killed by King Yongjo, the grandfather of Cheongjo, probably because he was a little bit strange in the head, but they didn't know what to do with him. But anyway, it was a great mentally a wound for King Cheongjo. And when he became king, he made great efforts to rehabilitate his father and to do for his father whatever he could do. In some ways he did this the official way, for instance by creating a kind of shrine inside the city wall, even near the palaces. And when you walk in the grounds of Seoul National Hospital, you still find some remains of it, not much of it. But anyway, it's a place very near to the palaces. But outside the city wall, actually in Suwon at a certain distance, he had a temple restored, the Yongju-sa, for his father. And the interesting thing is that when you look, for instance, in the Joseon Wangju Shilok, the official annals of the Joseon period, you see that the Yongju-sa is mentioned twice, but nothing about being for the founder of King Cheongjo or something, but the king passes Yongju-sa, it says, that's all. So in a way it shows how it was a private thing for the king also, although he collected money from the whole country to build a temple, but still it was a private thing. Another thing, he reprinted the sutra I mentioned earlier, of which we saw the pictures, Bumo and Jungyang, the sutra of the heavy debt you have to your parents. And that this temple is not just an ordinary temple, but related to the royal house. You can also see, because of this red gate, similar to, for instance, the red gates you will see at the Sadiq altars, which are official. So it has some kind of official status as well. This is another example of a temple which has very deep connections with the royal family. May maintain these connections almost throughout the entire Joseon period. The Heungcheonsa. It's now in Songbukdang, more or less surrounded by high-rise apartments. But of course it used to be outside the city walls. And you find there this curious example of calligraphy. And why is this childish calligraphy exhibited? Because it was written by a prince who had a connection, Yongqinwang, so a prince who never had a chance anymore to become king. And so in the early 20th century, I think he was 5-year-old when he this. So in the Joseon period, in some ways, you could call Seoul a kind of Confucian sacred city. All Buddhist temples had been removed from the city itself. But you had what was left were royal temples and royal shrines. But when you look around on maps, what was outside the city wall, and sometimes very, very close actually, just a few meters outside the city wall, there were all kinds of Buddhist shrines, and from the palace there was a constant stream of people who went there to pray also. And inside the city, it is striking that one of the big annual festivities was the birthday of the Buddha. People would hang out lanterns, so that was, in that sense, there would be a massive celebration of Buddhism, even if officially Buddhist monks were not allowed inside the city. It's another, what's often called the White Buddha, this connected also with the founder of the Joseon dynasty. So there's a story about it, which I'll maybe, with a few to the time, will cut. There were also, until the 17th century, what you might call care facilities for court ladies. In many cases, of course, old women who had lost their husbands. And one of these places was this temple, which is not far out of the city wall. And the wife of King Tanjong was very, very young when she became a widow, because Tanjong was almost a boy when he was killed. And so she survived him for 60 years in this place. And even nowadays, there's a small hill nearby where she would go up every day to do obeisance in the direction of the place where her husband had died. I think Koon Mong had the dream of the 9 clouds, the 9-cloud dream. Many of them, you know, it is built on a kind of Buddhist scheme, and it shows very deep knowledge of Buddhism. Again, you see that Buddhists of Confucians would read Buddhist texts. Another Confucian who would read Buddhist texts quite a lot is the famous Ta San. He was, of course, a Confucian. He could not become an official. He's also famous because he is supposed to have become a Catholic at a certain moment, but he repented, unlike a brother who was killed for being a Catholic. But in some ways, you could just as well say that he was a Buddhist, because all through his life he had connections with Buddhism. You see Ta San's different attitudes. When he was in an official function, he would point out the abuses of Buddhism. Monks and nuns have been notorious since olden times for exploiting innocent people using talismans and chanting invocations. But privately he wrote, with a pine leaf hat on, sipping soup made of pine leaves, I would rather delve into Buddha's teachings in my remaining years in this world. There's not a feeling which he only had near his death, he had also much earlier. And then here are the quotations which show that he was interested in Buddhism, and there are ample documents which show that he was in close contact with all kinds of Buddhist monks. This is the Pongens I have already mentioned, which is also one of these temples which had connections with the royal family. And one of the persons who had these connections was the Taewongun, the Prince Regent, who was the father of King Kojong, the last Korean king who had any real power. And even today, the Taewongun is honored by the inscription saying that he made donations to the temple. Again, Kojong, his son, when his son was ill, there were prayers done at Suguksa, this temple here, which also was in Wondang. And then Kojong says that filial piety and Buddhist faith and origin are not two. So he had a very open attitude to Buddhism. A famous intellectual who was in many ways, you can't just call a Buddhist, actually, Chusa Kim Jong-hee had I think the most famous calligrapher. This is his last piece of calligraphy for the hall, the signboard for the hall where the wood blocks are kept for this sutra, the Avatamsaka Sutra, Frahamgyong, which was reprinted in 1856. And then it's very interesting to see who were the people who supported the reprinting of this book. The king, King Joseon, the Queen Dowager, the wife of a posthumous king, someone who was made king after he had already died, the father-in-law of King Hongdong, and maybe the most striking thing actually is four former headmasters of the Sungkyunkwan, the highest institution of Confucian learning, and several other officials. Cho Hee-rong also. How many minutes do I exactly have? Because,
I think you were fine. 5 minutes?
Okay, I'll have to rush a little bit. So Cho Hee-rong is a famous painter, but he has also written. He had an interest in Buddhism, but he was a Confucian, and also, but he thought that in some ways they're very similar. Can we say that, as sometimes has been said actually, that in Joseon Buddhism was oppressed and degenerated? And the degeneration is especially when it becomes superstitious, it goes down among the population to the lower layers of society. That's very difficult to state, because you see also that many stele for commemorating monks have inscriptions written by really very famous Confucian scholars. We know that in the 19th century meditation was practiced among many intellectuals, many Confucian intellectuals in a sense. That didn't start at that time. There were earlier also Confucians who practiced meditation, but it became really popular in the 19th century apparently. In the 19th century, you also have a lay association, the Soul for Pure Land Practices, who published books in Chinese. They belong to a kind of urban middle class, I'm tempted to say. And they had often prefaces by people who start to identify themselves as Confucians. And so there were many interfaces for Buddhist Confucian contact and all kinds of Confucian dialogue. I'll give you several instances of that already. So there's a kind of new consensus at the moment among scholars that Joseon Buddhism was much more vital than it has been given credit for. And this is important also for its regeneration in the 20th century. There's no doubt that it became, in certain senses, stronger. So these two people, on the left a Confucian, on the right a Buddhist monk, who has apparently achieved the state of holiness already. It's not a real contrast. The interesting thing is that in a way you see this also because the Confucian scholar has this small rosary on his desk. Then there is something which this is so far quite well accepted, but there is something more controversial. I think in some ways we should look at the whole history of especially 18th, 19th century in a slightly different way. You should change perspective. Are, in this period, filial piety and loyalty really Confucian virtues? I think actually maybe there is no ground to call them Confucian any longer. And the person who helped me to this insight actually was a shaman, Pyongyang Harmony. In 1992, she was invited to London there was a conference about Korean shamanism today, and she performed a ritual, and part of this ritual was an offerings which looked like Confucian chesa. And the next day, the people could ask her questions, and then one person asked, the chesa you performed yesterday, was this Confucian chesa? And then she was really puzzled. And then in the end she said, it's Korean chesa. So my point is that actually at a certain moment when it has been part and parcel for a long time, not only of Confucianism but also of other forms of religion, why call it any longer Confucian? The example I like to give usually is that very few people these days will think Christianity is a Middle Eastern religion. Of course it is in origin, but it is, if you say Middle Eastern religion, we think maybe rather of Islam, but no longer of Christianity. So it is a kind of change of perspective I would advocate actually. So now we can also ask, is late Joseon, is there a rise of Buddhism again, or is there a declining domination of Confucianism? First we start with the rise of Buddhism. There are changes. The attitudes are becoming more positive. There's public recognition of the contribution in the battle against the Japanese. There's a lot of support from rich people, Yangban, people from the court, for the rebuilding of temples. There are actually more temples than there officially should be, many more monks also. There's a certain popularity of Buddhist kasa, Buddhist songs. There's elite interest in meditation, we have already seen that. There's elite interest in philosophical scriptures. There's a printing also of all kinds of Buddhist manuals in Chinese. And there's printing of bilingual text to promote the veneration of the Buddha Amitabha, which also included kasa, which are more intended to spread the faith among people who were not able to read Chinese. And for the rituals, you have a book like this, for instance, but this book I think is particularly interesting. It's an 18th century book called Yombul Pogonlun. And here is what it is a text to promote the invocation of Amitabha, which is a practice which will allow you to be reborn in the Pure Land when you die. It's especially important when you're in the moment of dying. If you, with your whole heart, concentrate on invoking Amitabha, you can do it without making a kind of unpleasant detour to hell or something. Now the interesting thing about this text is that it was produced in the 18th century, first time printed in 1704, bilingual, so also with the Hangul, and was constantly reprinted. And So that shows that it was a quite widely spread text at that time, so influential text, you may say. So what is the purpose? I've already mentioned. The important thing is the last line, the conclusion, that once you are reborn in the paradise of Amitabha, in fact, one thing that is considered to be essential to Buddhism, and that is the constant rebirth, is stopped, because the teaching of Amitabha, to which you can listen every day in this paradise, will make it impossible for you to regress. So you will be there for all your life, or all your life, maybe is not the word, for your further existence. And in the end, you will even turn into Buddha yourself. May last a while, but still. So there is an end to this constant cycle of birth and rebirth, which in a way is a good thing, because there was not only this concept of heaven in the form of this pure land, but there is also concept of hell. First picture of showing people going to heaven in the dragon boat. This is what heaven actually might look like. And this is what hell might look like. So you are judged there when you come there. You're taken there by people who are suspiciously like kind of monsters, but in their behavior a bit like very rough servants of justice. And they take you as if you're a prisoner with the kang, which was also used in China and Korea for prisoners. And they will, in all kinds of ways, find out what you have been doing. And if you have done anything which was not right according to Buddhist standards, and you're punished for a certain while, you have to expiate all your evil deeds in some way, and sometimes they cook you, they burn you, for instance, but sometimes also they make you suffer by cold. This is the icy hell. This is the punishment for people who have slandered others, and so your tongue is taken out and it's plowed by with an ox. And the plowshare, so here another book is actually a slightly earlier book, which in a way in 2 pages only gives you all the options. Here someone is looking at what is called a karma mirror, which shows what you have done during your lifetime, and the text here says you can't hide anything. Here are people who apparently have done well and are going to paradise. This is a messenger of the underworld. These people are cooked in hell, and so on. So these are the options. This actually is the most, to me, one of the most puzzling things. It looks actually like a figure which, for the rest, you only see in Japanese prints, Aizen, but I cannot explain why it's there. But the rest of it is this whole constellation of heaven and hell we have been talking about. Another picture of these nectar paintings, which basically have the same things. Here you have, for instance, a scene of war, which shows how people die before their time, and can die before their time. And then here there's hell scene, for instance. And again, here the Buddhas who make salvation possible. Here's a picture which links the sutta for the parents to this belief in Amitabha. At the end of when your parents have died, it's still the duty of the children to have rituals performed so that they can be reborn in Amitabha's paradise. And you see this here, the son is carrying his parents to paradise, actually. That is the idea behind it. Well, you have a big contrast, which is also very clear in this this book, this Yombo Pogonmun, between heaven, the pure land, and hell, which is actually more like a purgatory because it's supposed not to be permanent. Now, in Buddhist texts, like the sutra, like the kasa, the songs, which you also have in Yombul Pogonmun, this book, there's an emphasis on the vanity of our earthly existence, or existences, because you may be born and reborn. Everything is evanescent. You cannot take your prized possessions into the next life. Repeat it again and again. Everyone will be judged afterwards. It doesn't matter whether you are a king, you will go there too. Also, gender doesn't matter. But the opposite is also true. Women also actually may go to paradise. Although maybe they have to change shape into a man, but still it's possible. Then there's one point which is a little bit puzzling actually sometimes from a purely logical point of view. If, for instance, in the last moment of your life, you really, with full devotion, invoke Amitabha, you may be reborn in this paradise, even if you're a murderer or a butcher, the murderer of animals. Huh? So there is salvation possible by kind of grace of a higher being. And once you are reborn, this heaven becomes a kind of semi-permanent state. You might, within this heaven, you might still proceed to become a Buddha, for instance. That's fine, but you will never regress to the ordinary earthly life, let alone hell. Now, we come to another thing, the striking success of Catholicism in 18th century Korea. Now, this by the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, you see that suddenly a lot of people convert to Catholicism. What's the answer? Well, how can we explain this? And there's not a single answer, but I'm going to say it's not the only answer. For men, it's no doubt the fact that Jesuits and other missionaries in China had produced books in which they explained Catholicism in a way Confucians would understand it. So that was very helpful. But you had to be able to read Chinese, of course. Then, particularly for women who mostly were unable to read Chinese, what was the attraction? There were many, we know, among the early martyrs of Catholicism, there were many women. Why were they attracted? And my idea is that actually the familiarity of the ideas of heaven and hell, which they knew from Buddhism, may have been helpful, as will have been the idea of the ultimate vanity of earthly life, which you also find in these Buddhist texts. And also the idea of the divine, a superhuman grace, which can grant salvation to the truly contrite sinner, however grave the sins of the sinner may have been. So that explains, in a way, might explain maybe the success of Catholicism to a certain extent. On the other hand, also you see, in my view, a definite weakening of the dominance of Confucianism, because the core values of filial piety and loyalty were no longer purely Confucian. And you see that there's a religious quest for alternatives to or complements of Confucianism, especially when death and the problem of death is concerned. And this Buddhist belief in the afterlife and our transitory and existence in this world clashed rather with the Confucian idea that we have only this one existence in which we really should try to realize our full potential only. So it's this life in which you should try to gain glory and honor. And the Confucians in general tended to discourage belief in the lasting existence after death, although they had a kind of fake kind of belief that you could still have a kind of existence after death, but it was not very strong. Now, all this, I think, made Confucianism very vulnerable once the institutional structure that supported Confucianism fell away. Until 1894, when the state examinations were abolished, all men who had aspirations to get on in the world had to study Confucian classics. After 1894, not so much anymore. That was more a matter of free will. And so then it's very striking, actually, when you look at the 20th century history, you see that Confucianism as an institution almost evaporates. The groups who organize themselves, there are still some Confucian groups, but they're very small in numbers. But you have many other kinds of religious organizations. And so I've earlier said that Catholics profited from the similarity of Buddhist ideas about heaven and hell, but I think the Protestants too, in a way, could rely on this. And then there's maybe the most uncertain proposition I'm going to making today. In the Buddhist concept, originally in Buddhism, actually women were a lower form of existence. There's no denying about it, but in the end, women actually were equal. They had the same potential to become Buddhas. And sometimes it's said through the intermediary stage of a man. You could change in a man and then you can be reborn in paradise. But the striking thing is that already in Yombul Pogwanmun, in the Hangul text you find there, this is completely omitted. They just say young, old men, women, they can all go to the pure land of Amitabha. So then there's no emphasis on this at all anymore. And there's also this emphasis in the Kasa that to be rich won't help you in the afterlife. And this idea, could it have been helpful to a certain extent maybe to promote a more egalitarian society? Okay, I'll maybe skip this because if you want you can all read it. If you have any desire to read up a bit on these subjects, and you can find it in the material which I have listed at the end. Thank you very much.